welcome to my latest video on books to read if you're going to go travelling somewhere. And today what I'm going to talk about is books that I've read all about Cuba, which helped enrich my trip both before and afterwards. As with the normal format, I divide the books that I've seen in different categories, and the first category that I'm going to talk about are books that I've read that are about the general history and politics of Cuba. And the first one of these is this one. It is called Cuba, What Everyone Needs to Know by Julia E. Sweig. And Julia E. Sweig she's an American lady. She's an academic, and she's also written a few other books on Latin American type studies. Okay, these are, I didn't realise this What Everyone Needs to Know, it's a series of books about a variety of different places and issues. But this is the first one of them I've come across, and I was really impressed with this book. It's divided into, the structure is largely questions. So, for example, we have here, how did Cuba's final war for independence begin? And then it gives you a brief explanation. That said, it's generally chronological, and it's quite simply and effectively written. I don't think it's that biased politically, either for or against the revolution. And I think for somebody like me, who was coming into this with very, very little knowledge about Cuba, this is a good place to start, so I do recommend that book. Okay, the next one was one that I knew I was always going to have to read if I'm going to Cuba, and that is Fidel Castro, My Life. And this is Fidel's autobiography, except that it's not, because it says with Ignacio Ramonet, who is a French journalist who Fidel got on with. He'd known over the years, and this was the guy he decided was going to do the autobiography. And actually, what it is, it's a series of interviews, and there is also the backstory of these interviews is given, and it was written, I'm not quite sure when, probably about 10 years ago, I would imagine. Let's see what it says. 2007, so yeah, 9 years ago. When Fidel was, getting on a bit, and he's basically about to give up power. So, this book is not an easy read. It's pretty big, 700 odd pages. There's a lot of text in there, but it is a good read. And for anybody who's interested in contemporary Cuba, read this, because this man has done more than anybody else to shape Cuba today, be that good or bad, depending on how you look at things. I read it, and again, it's an interview book, so it's not a standard autobiography. It is literally the conversation. If you'll have a look here on this page, the lines in bold are Ignacio Ramonet's, and then the very lengthy replies are Fidel's. Fidel is known for talking a lot, and yeah, he has a lot to say. That said, I think it comes across, the human element comes across really well in this, and I thought very positively of Fidel after I read this. He admits some of the mistakes they made. He admits that some things could have been better, some things were worse, and he comes across as somebody who's aware of his flaws as well as his successes. And he doesn't delve into that language that too many socialist books, particularly from his era, delve into, where it's all very dense, where they're talking about reactionary traitors and imperialist plotters and all this kind of stuff. And I've read a lot of socialist stuff, and I love reading socialist books, but they could tone the language down a bit at times, and Fidel's not too bad for that. But he does go on a bit, and he does repeat himself a bit at times. The next one is, of course, the other main man of the Cuban Revolution was Ernesto Che Guevara, Reminiscences of the Cuban Revolutionary War. This book, for anybody who's seen the film, forms the basis for film Che Part 1, and I think that still is probably from there. This was not the first work by Che Guevara I read. Whilst I was in Cuba, I read the African Diaries about the failed expedition to Congo. And I also read Motorcycle Diaries, which is his most famous work. And it's absolutely brilliant and kind of shows you a lot of how he came to be the man that he is here. I didn't enjoy this as much as the Motorcycle Diaries, but it is a very good book, and like with anything by Che, it's pretty readable. Again, as with his mate Fidel, he talks about his own flaws and failings just as much as his successes. He does delve into the dense language perhaps a bit more than Fidel. I think certainly at the time of the Revolutionary War, he was a far more committed communist than Fidel was. But it just brings to life the struggle and how very small scale it was. He talks about battles and there's 20 people involved and things like that. And it just makes you realise that how a very small group of people, because at one time I think they were down to 12 fighters, can change the world. So it's quite an inspirational book. It is in different parts. The first section is very much like a diary, and then I think he probably stopped bothering to keep a diary. But there's odd episodes. Yeah, it's good. I would recommend this, but I think you can't really go to Cuba and not read that, can you? Okay, so that's those ones. Now going on to other works that I've read about the general history and politics. I have to give this one a mention. This one was recommended in another book I read, which I will come to in a second, as being just a seminal text by Fidel. It's not about Cuba per se, but it really does relate to Cuba a lot. So I think it is a good book to read whilst you're in Cuba. It's called Fidel and Religion, and I believe he was the first ever world leader, certainly the first communist leader, to give his thoughts on religion. And again, it shows so much of the man that he will admit that he was wrong at times. As with the other book, it's done with somebody else. This is with Frei Betto. Frei Betto is a priest. I think he's from Brazil, and he was a liberation theologist. So they're the ones that saw Christianity through a very Marxist lens. And so also, if you're interested in liberation theology, this is a good book to read, because I think one might call Fidel a liberation theologist. And Cuba, when I went there, I found that it had really quite a relaxed attitude to religion. Although in terms of organised religion, I don't think it was ever that deeply Catholic anyway. Certainly not in the countryside. And Fidel talks about why this is. My only criticism with this is about the first 40-odd pages or so were all about his childhood. And after having read that only a month or two before, it was like I was reading the same thing again twice. So don't read these too close together. But yeah, great book if you can get hold of it. It's a bit of a pain to get hold of. I couldn't find it anywhere in Havana, but I got it somewhere by the road. And my last works by the man himself are Reflections 1 and Reflections 2. And these are short pieces that he wrote in the early 2000s. If I'm honest, they're not that good. They're a bit ranty. And they don't all relate to Cuba. I expected more from these. But, you know, if you're into Fidel and you want to know more about what he thought or thinks, he's still with us, just, yeah, check those out. Okay, now I'm going to talk about travelogues. And the first travelogue of Cuba that I read is this one. This is Dervla Murphy, The Island That Dared. And I have to say, I love the title. I think the title is a brilliant one. However, was the book as good? I'm a bit mixed about it. There's a lot of this book. I mean, there are, how many pages? 416 pages, which you might think, oh, it doesn't look that big. But you know what? Look at the size of this text. It's just a lot of writing, and the chapters are long, and it's a bit of a plough through at times. Now, Dervla Murphy, if you're not aware, she's an Irish author. She's really quite old these days. I think her first book was published in '65, So she's probably, yeah, born in 31. So, I mean, what does that make her? She's probably in her 80s now. So it's pretty impressive that she is still travelling. Um, I've read, I think, 3 or 4 of her books. Yeah, 4 of them I've read. And they're all a bit the same in that while I agree with her views, because she's very ecologist, she's quite left-wing, and she's a very serious traveller, and I agree with her views probably about 80%. The fact that she really shoves them down your throat all the time annoys me, and, and I think I respect the fact that she travels very deeply in the country, and she obviously has a great passion for Cuba. But there's too much in here. And what Dervla Murphy needs is an editor. And she has needed an editor, I think, in all the books that I've read by her, but particularly this one. And in the end, you can't help getting a bit annoyed about her. I mean, I'll be fair with you. The ones that particularly in which she starts going on about her grandchildren and her pets and stuff, which she does in all the other books. And I'm not really a pet guy, even though I'm sat next to a hamster at the moment. But, and I haven't got grandchildren yet, so who knows if I'll be into them. But yeah, I just, just cut it down a bit, Dervla. Cut it down a bit. Keep it a bit more concise. Because actually, generally what you've got to say is good, but it could have been done in half that. So, would I recommend this or not? Not wishing to be harsh, probably not. That said, on a plus point, it was Dervla who raved about Fidel and religion, which I really did recommend, and I wouldn't have read had it not been for her. Now, I was in 2 minds as to whether to recommend Dervla Murphy's book, but the next one, The Other Side of Paradise, I really am definitely sure I am not going to recommend at all. This book really, really, really disappointed me. Now, why? Possibly because I got the wrong impression. I thought it would be a bit of a Cuban travelogue. If I read the back, and in fact I can't because there's stickers all over it, because it came from excuse me, a library. Yeah, it came from a library. So, but yeah, it says Cooke embedded herself in Cuba, covered by a sticker, and it talks about intimate storytelling or with in-depth reportage. The Other Side of Paradise weaves together stories of the Cubans whom Cooke encountered, providing a vivid and unprecedented look into the daily lives and future prospects of young people in Cuba today. I think my problem is it says The Other Side of Paradise, life in the new Cuba. And from that background, I would expect her to be, going around and talking to lots of Cubans and getting lots of different views. And she doesn't. It should be the life in the new Havana, because she never seems to leave Havana. In fact, she never even seems to leave a little bit of Havana, which is the bit around where she lives. Now, I get the fact that if you're living somewhere, you're going to want to talk about that, and that you're going to know that more intimately. And yeah, if I did a book about, I don't know, Britain, it would be largely centred on Stoke-on-Trent, because that's where I live and that's what I know best. But the problem is I wanted a book about Cuba, and Havana is the capital of Cuba, and anybody who's done any kind of travelling knows that capitals do not represent the countries that they're in. And often when I'm in London, I feel like I'm in a separate country. It's really, really radically different from the rest of England, let alone the rest of the UK. And it's the same with Cuba. You get different attitudes in Havana. Capitals attract a certain type of people. And so the people, what I found is it wasn't a very balanced account at all, by the fact it was largely in the capital. I think she makes 1 trip out. And that also tells me something about her. This is lazy. This is lazy reporting. It's like, well, I can't be bothered to go anywhere, so I'll just write about what's down the road. And that is so bad. I mean, if you're gonna be the window onto a country for people who maybe can't go there, obviously Americans, there's an embargo on, then, at least be bothered to get out. But also that she picks, and to be fair, it does say young people here, but, life in the new Cuba also, there's older people, there's, people who don't fit into the demographic that she wants to hang out with. And what you get, I believe, is a very biased book. Now, I haven't lived in Cuba, but I have been there. And to me, this is very, very anti-regime. Not overtly, but because she only ever talks to people who don't like the regime. There are people who don't like the regime. When I was in Havana, there were people who said bad things about the regime, and fair play, you know. But there was also people who were very, very positive about it. And, you know, I think she was given a remit to write a book that's anti-regime, or she just didn't like the regime, so she thought she'd do that. And you get the impression of a very, very different country than the one that I found. So do not buy this. Julia Cooke, please do some research. Stop being lazy. If you want some tips, come over to here to England, and I will teach you how to research, because I'm not an expert, but I'm better than this. Okay, and finally, the travelogues, not travelogues, the travel guides. And I took 2 travel guides to Cuba, and here they are. There is Lonely Planet Cuba and Footprint Guide Dream Trip Cuba. Both of these were good. Now, people have seen, or if you haven't, check out my guide to travel guides that I've done already. But if you have watched that, you'll know that I generally used to buy Lonely Planet all the time. Got a bit angry and a bit frustrated with Lonely Planet and the direction they were going, so switched to Brad, except for the places where Brad don't do guides, and Cuba's one of them. So I'm back on the Lonely Planets for Cuba, and it is what a Lonely Planet guide always is. You see, we've got the maps, we've got the information, we've got the box text, all that kind of stuff. I have to say, considering recent Lonely Planets that I've read or bought, this one annoyed me far less than a lot of them. It was far less opinionated. It wasn't particularly anti-regime, which was good. And it wasn't amazing as a guide, but I was generally pretty happy with this guide. And I would say, yeah, if you're going to Cuba, I always recommend buying a guide, and I think this one would be a very good one. Actually, and relating this back to my video that I did on travel guides, one of the reasons why people may not buy a guide these days is because of the easy internet access and where we can get loads of stuff on the internet. Access to the internet is a pain in Cuba, so I would say you probably need a guide in Cuba more because of that than you would in other countries. So bear that in mind. You can get on the internet, but it's only in certain places, and the connections are awful. So, yeah, buy a guide, and I recommend this. Finally, the footprint one, I bought this because I had a footprint guide to Andalusia, which was good, and I thought, well, I'm not entirely happy with Lonely Planet, let's try something else. This wasn't as good as the Lonely Planet. The layout's not bad, there's not too much text and that. There wasn't as much information in this as Lonely Planet. What I didn't like was how it was set out. And you see, it's called Dream Trip. And what they do is they give you itineraries. And there's 3 different itineraries. And so, basically, you've got to follow that itinerary. Or else it doesn't work as well. And, of course, places that are not on them are not in the book. Even though I didn't follow an itinerary, but, you know, all the places I went were more or less the ones on here. It was good, and at times I used it instead of the Lonely Planet, but it wasn't as comprehensive, and I didn't like that itinerary setup. That said, I may have made a mistake, and they may do a normal Cuba guide, which just covers the whole country in a more standard way. But when I went on the internet, this was the one that came out. There was this and a Havana one. I didn't want just a Havana one, so I bought this. Not bad, you know, if Lonely Planet are really doing your head in, then give it a go. But generally speaking, I would recommend the Lonely Planet over Footprint Guide Dream Trip. And that is the end of my Cuba book look. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it's helpful. Please subscribe if you like my videos down there. And also, if you've got any comments about any books that you may have read, any that you would recommend, or if you disagree or agree with my comments, please put them down, because I just find feedback is so helpful. So anyway, Thanks for watching and keep travelling.